Let me give you just 6 examples of things we need to think about much more deeply than we have. The first is this. I would suggest it is very obvious that the developing world cannot move to the developed world. So what do we do? Who can come? That's one part of that question. And the second part, which is much harder, who can't? We are very, very bad at having even a bit of that debate, but we need to. Secondly, what are the differences between people fleeing for their lives from a war zone and people fleeing serious, severe economic deprivation in, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa? Now, there are differences, but if you recognize that, then you've got to work out where along the way you would put your line for legitimate asylum claims. A third of people in sub-Saharan Africa polled last year by Gallup said they wanted to move and leave sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got to work out along this way, if you're going to have a sustainable asylum policy, who qualifies for it. And I would suggest we're not very good at having that discussion either. A third point. We know that some cultures find it easier to mix into other cultures than others, but we don't know exactly how. And we don't know what the proportions of people are in another culture that work well, integrate well.
In a world grappling with complex issues of immigration, economic disparity, and cultural integration, few voices cut through the noise with the clarity and intellectual rigor of Douglas Murray. As an author, political commentator, and associate editor of The Spectator, Murray has long been a prominent figure in the United Kingdom, known for his unapologetic stance on some of the most contentious topics of our time. One of the most memorable moments in his career came during a public debate where he engaged with a Muslim girl, addressing her concerns and ultimately leaving her speechless. This encounter not only highlighted Murray's depth of knowledge and persuasive abilities, but also underscored the importance of open, honest dialogue in resolving the issues that divide us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you here in Doha. I've been traveling across several continents in recent years, not just to the countries that people are fleeing from around the world, but also to the places they're fleeing to the refugee camps, migrant camps that people end up in. And I've been struck by so many thoughts during this time, but one of them is that there are so many utopian dreams that occur. People dream that you could live in a borderless world on one hand. Other people pretend you could just stop anyone coming. These are impossible dreams, but somewhere in the middle of them is something we need to aim for. And one of the ways I've started to realize that we need to think about this is in the following terms, not about right or wrong or, good and bad, I'm a good person, you're a Nazi. It's too easy. What we need to think about with this is that we're in a situation with migration talking about competing virtues. There are 2 virtues in this whole debate that are in serious competition, not just between people, but within all of us. The first virtue, I would say, is the virtue of mercy, the desire to be merciful to our fellow human beings who are suffering. And we all feel that. Everybody should feel that. But there is also another virtue here, the virtue of justice. And that's not just justice for people fleeing countries, but justice for people in the countries that they are fleeing to. And we can't ignore those 2 parts. We need to recognize that's what's going on here. This is why it's so difficult, and the debate goes down the middle of all of us. So look, there are so many questions we need to think about if we're going to address this. And I'm so glad, by the way, this isn't a debate, because this is a very not debatable issue. But why we need to think about this. Let me give you just 6 examples of things we need to think about much more deeply than we have. The first is this. I would suggest it is very obvious that the developing world cannot move to the developed world. So what do we do? Who can come? That's one part of that question. And the second part, which is much harder, who can't? We are very, very bad at having even a bit of that debate, but we need to. Secondly, what are the differences between people fleeing for their lives from a war zone and people fleeing serious, severe economic deprivation in, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa? Now, there are differences, but if you recognize that, then you've got to work out where along the way you would put your line for legitimate asylum claims. A third of people in sub-Saharan Africa polled last year by Gallup said they wanted to move and leave sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got to work out along this way, if you're going to have a sustainable asylum policy, who qualifies for it. And I would suggest we're not very good at having that discussion either. A third point. We know that some cultures find it easier to mix into other cultures than others, but we don't know exactly how. And we don't know what the proportions of people are in another culture that work well, integrate well, adapt well, and what the proportions are that start to make that integration, that adaptation far harder. We have thought very little about this, and what thinking there has been pretty bad. Let me give you another example of something we need to think about. How do we deal with a question this serious in the age of social media? An age when a single photograph of a single person can go all around the world, and everybody sees it, and everybody says something must be done. And their politicians think, I've got to do something. And then they do something, and the public say, no, that wasn't the something we were thinking of. We've thought of something else, but we don't know what. How do we live in that world? How do politicians act in that world? How do we have any form of political leadership in that world? How do we work out what the right thing to do is in that world? Not just in the short term, but in the long term too. I'll give you a fifth question. How do we ensure that we're able to have a serious and deep debate about these issues, and that we're able to allow people to express legitimate concerns and have that debate without those legitimate concerns being dismissed as xenophobic, nativist, and so on? How do we work out where that might be the case? And how do we work out where it's not, where there are legitimate fears? Sixth question. How do we overcome fatalism? Fatalism you hear everywhere these days, sometimes in the spirit of optimism. This is the world as it is now. People move. This is globalization. Get used to it. Suck it up. Don't complain. How do we get used to that? How do we deal with that? Now, I've got, rather unsurprisingly, fewer answers than I've got questions. But let me give you just 3 answers I would suggest that we could hold on to as the beginning of a set of answers to this. The first is, hold a very clear line between people fleeing for their lives from war zones and people fleeing economic deprivation. Find and hold to a very clear line on it. If you do not, I predict with absolute certainty that you will continue to erode public sympathy with people who need the sympathy the most, because these things will be rubbed together and elided. So I would suggest, first of all, find that and hold on to it pretty close. Second thing I would suggest, find a broad level of agreement, and there is a lot of this internationally now, that the best way to cope with the most serious situations is to keep people roughly in the area of the country for which they fled. It's much easier to look after them there. It's much easier to get international aid there. My own country, Great Britain, is, I think, the second largest donor of international aid within the regions of Syria. That should, I think, be one of the models for this, that we make sure that we don't have this idea that some people have that you disperse X percentage there and X percentage there and put these people there. Thirdly, I would say make sure you increase economic productivity in refugee camps. Make sure people have a hope and a purpose and a work life when they're outside of their country. Look, I'm concluding with this because otherwise the music will get so loud you won't hear me. There are no simple answers to this, because there are no simple questions in this. This whole business does not give itself to sound bites, but it does need a much deeper debate than most of us have been willing to have so far. Thank you.
All right.
The setting for this debate was a lively and diverse public forum designed to bring together voices from all sides of the political spectrum. Murray, ever the seasoned debater, was well prepared to tackle the thorny issues of immigration and cultural integration. He began by setting the stage with 6 key examples of things society needs to consider more deeply. The first point he raised was the obvious but often overlooked fact that the developing world cannot simply move to the developed world. This statement, while straightforward, encapsulated the logistical and ethical challenges that lie at the heart of the immigration debate.
Traveling across several continents in recent years, not just to the countries that people are fleeing from around the world, but also to the places they're fleeing to the refugee camps, migrant camps that people end up in. And I've been struck by so many thoughts during this time, but one of them is that there are so many utopian dreams that people dream that you could live in a borderless world on one hand. Other people pretend you could just stop anyone coming. These are impossible dreams, but somewhere in the middle of them is something we need to aim for. And one of the ways I've started to realize that we need to think about this is in the following terms, not about right or wrong or, good and bad. I'm a good person, you're a Nazi. It's too easy. What we need to think about with this is that we're in a situation with migration talking about competing virtues. There are 2 virtues in this whole debate that are in serious competition, not just between people, but within all of us. The first virtue, I would say, is the virtue of mercy, the desire to be merciful to our fellow human beings who are suffering And we all feel that. Everybody should feel that. But there is also another virtue here, the virtue of justice. And that's not just justice for people fleeing countries, but justice for people in the countries that they are fleeing to. We can't ignore those two parts. We need to recognize that's what's going on here. This is why it's so difficult, and the debate goes down the middle of all of us. So look, there are so many questions we need to think about if we're going to address this. And I'm so glad, by the way, this isn't a debate, because this is a very not debatable issue, but why we need to think about it.
Murray's assertion prompted a crucial question. Who can come, and perhaps more controversially, who cannot? This is where the debate often falters, as societies struggle to balance compassion with practicality. Murray pointed out that we are particularly bad at having this debate, shying away from the uncomfortable but necessary discussions about the limits of our capacity to accommodate new arrivals.
Well, I'm joined now by Talk TV contributors Esther Cracker and Paula Rowan-Adrian. And first, from Tel Aviv, the author and associate editor of The Spectator, Douglas Murray. Douglas, let's start with what's going on over there with you, and then we'll come to this migration story. A big day tomorrow in this war, a pause, the release of 13 hostages, we believe women and children. What is the feeling about this? You know, many people are saying from a distance that this looks like a sort of slow form of water torture for these poor families. Drip, drip, drip of people being let out. No one knows who it is until the last minute, and so on. Agony for these families.
Yes, it's an agonizing time in Israel. Everybody in Israel would like to see the people who were kidnapped on the 7th of October return to their families, what remains of their families in many cases. And it's absolutely agonizing. Last night I was with many of the families in Tel Aviv as we were waiting to hear the news of what was meant to be an exchange, a handover of some of the kidnapped people this morning. That then didn't happen. We're now waiting for it to happen tomorrow morning. We don't know for certain it'll happen. We thought it would happen today. Now it's meant to be tomorrow. It's agonizing for the families. One mother this evening discovered that her 2 children are not on the list that has been given out to some families, telling them that their loved ones are going to be in the release tomorrow. And of course, there are many families. One I was speaking with earlier, their son was 21. He was at the rave and was abducted by Hamas, stolen with 3 of his friends. He's 21. It's only people under the age of 18 that are being focused on at the moment, but many of the families feel, you know, they want them all home. And the problem, of course, that Israel is now in is a problem that Israelis know very well, which is the completely unfair exchange of the hostages. The Israeli government is talking about releasing 3 Palestinian prisoners, that is, people who have, for instance, been sent to prison in Israel for carrying out terrorist offences, releasing 3 of these people for every 1 child that Hamas are going to release. And there's an added kick to this. Sirwan, the head of Hamas in Gaza, who was the person who planned and led the operation on the 7th of October that killed 1,400 Israelis and led to these Israelis being kidnapped, is a man who was himself released in just such a prisoner swap 10 years ago. That was when Israel released more than 1,000 people from Israeli prisons, Palestinians from Israeli prisons, and returned them for a single soldier, Gilad Shalit, who Israel, of course, wanted back. So there's a horrible kicker to all of this, a horrible kicker, that we've seen this before, these exchanges. The people being released by Israel are people who stabbed people in the streets, carried out brutal terrorist attacks. They're being returned for children.
Douglas, is there any doubt that when this hostage release few days is over, that Israel will go back to attacking Gaza to get at Hamas? There are some people who hope that perhaps if this goes successfully over the next few days, that it may lead to a more permanent ceasefire. But is there any appetite for that, do you think, in the Netanyahu government?
Well, it really is a very, very serious conundrum, this, because Hamas is carrying out what you accurately describe as water torture of the Israelis. It can drip out small numbers of the abducted Israelis, and it knows that, for them, these are golden eggs. They know how much Israel cares about every citizen who was stolen from their families. They know how much they care. They know how much they can drag out international pressure on Israel to have a ceasefire. They know that they can keep on promising releases and then let down the families again and again. The problem that Israel has is that Benjamin Netanyahu says that he wants to destroy Hamas. Most Israelis feel, I think understandably, they cannot live with Hamas. And yet, of course, as long as Hamas has some hostages, has some people who've been kidnapped, it can try to stop operations going on in the Gaza to destroy Hamas. It's an incredibly ugly equation, but it's one that Hamas has performed before, as has Islamic Jihad and other terror groups in the Gaza. They are playing a game not just regionally, but internationally.
The second point Murray raised delved into the differences between people fleeing for their lives from war zones and those escaping severe economic deprivation. Using sub-Saharan Africa as an example, he highlighted the stark contrast between these two groups. While there is an undeniable moral imperative to help those fleeing conflict, the lines become blurred when considering those escaping poverty. Murray emphasised that recognising these differences is crucial in formulating a sustainable asylum policy. He cited a Gallup poll indicating that a third of people in sub-Saharan Africa expressed the desire to leave their region. This statistic underscores the enormity of the challenge, suggesting that an open-door policy is neither feasible nor sustainable. Murray's third point tackled the complex issue of cultural integration. He argued that some cultures find it easier to mix into others, but we lack a clear understanding of why this is the case. Moreover, we do not know the proportions of people from different cultures that can integrate successfully without causing friction. This lack of knowledge, Murray suggested, has led to poorly thought out policies that fail to address the real issues at hand.
And of course, the people who are suffering most are the families who have their loved ones in what state we don't know. A small number once again promised to be returned tomorrow. Again, what state they'll be in, we do not know. But yes, it's torture for the families.
I'm going to be talking to Norman Finkelstein in a few minutes. You've got strong opinions about him. I know you're going to stay and just listen to that interview and then react to that after, which I appreciate. Just before I go to the pack, just very quickly, if you don't mind, your reaction to these migration figures in the UK. Massively higher net migration last year than we've been led to believe. Very high again this year. This all from a Conservative government that promised to take back control of the borders and reduce net migration to tens of thousands.
Well, obviously, it's a political failure, a generational political failure that's just sped up in recent years. That it has happened, as you said, under consecutive leaders who've promised that exactly this wouldn't happen is a disaster for Britain. Quite what a disaster it is, I think we can already start to see. I remember when Giorgia Meloni was described as this far-out, far-right political leader in Italy, and she's now Prime Minister. I remember when Geert Wilders was described as this far-out, far-right political figure who wasn't even allowed into Britain in 2009 by a Labour Home Secretary. And now he's the main party leader in the Netherlands. So if anyone thinks that all of this just glides by endlessly without any political consequence, I'd just say raise your eyes a little and look to the continent.
Yeah, completely agree. Douglas, I'll talk to you a little later. Thank you very much. Yeah, Paul, I mean, there's a hard reality here.
Yes.
This migrant problem is not going away. It's getting worse. There are more and more people now coming across the continent trying to find somewhere to go. And you're seeing a rise of very right-wing populist leaders now winning elections as voters say, you know what, we need someone to do something about this.
Which is why we always have to be careful with the language that we use.
Right.
So you started with the word, the problem. There isn't a problem. We actually haven't...
You don't think
we
increasing population is a problem with the state of our NHS? I had an experience of the NHS recently, right, with a family member. And it was horrific. Partly horrific and partly great. The horrific part was an A&E. Have you been to an A&E in an NHS hospital recently?
I have.
I've
got 3 children, Piers.
It's like a war zone, right?
Yeah.
And you've got people who've just had heart attacks being left on trolleys in corridors for 6-7 hours. I know, because I know who it was, right? And then you get good treatment once you get through that system. But can we take millions more people in this country? Genuine question. As long as I've got any objection to any individual Can we sustain that pressure on our already creaking public services?
The reason why, so there's two different questions there. It's our creaking public services and can we take more people? The answer is we need more people.
As the debate progressed, Murray's insights drew a mixed reaction from the audience. Some nodded in agreement, appreciating his candid approach, while others seemed sceptical, if not outright hostile. It was at this point that a Muslim girl from the audience, a student from Georgetown University, stepped forward to challenge Murray. She asked a poignant question. Given the economic disparities between the developed and developing worlds, was it not fair for migrants to seek a better standard of living in first world countries, especially those that had historically benefited from the exploitation of their home nations? Her question was sharp, rooted in a sense of justice and historical accountability. It also touched on the broader narrative of colonialism and its long-lasting impacts.
The second answer to creaking public services is we need more people because our public services are creaking. Our government, over the last 13 years, has failed to protect our public services.
I think
government, it's really important to point out. It's really important to point out because I am also worried, as Douglas Murray says, about the rise of the right. And what is happening is that we're not being told the truth about immigration. We need more people to come into this country. Our net population is only rising at 200,000 on average over the last 3 years. That's it. 200,000.
Okay, that's twice the population of Solihull.
And what we are not being told is why we are unable to cope with the fact that we've got no housing, why the fact that the NHS is crumbling, why the fact that we are going to food banks, why the fact that our schools are crumbling. That is what we need to look at.
Esther?
The thing is, over 50% of those people, those figures that you've just quoted of the 750,000, they're dependents. So they're dependents of people coming in legally, so workers that have come in. So we're talking women and children mainly, who rely on the NHS, education, all of these things. At the end of the day, we have to admit Britain
that seems to be a big part of the problem.
But that's
which
the
is
issue.
not the actual skilled workers that we need, which I think we totally can all agree on that. It's the number of people that come with them, right? Family dependents is actually a very large number of people.
The thing is, I understand your point that we need these skilled workers, but at the end of the day, they are not coming without families and dependents who rely on our public services. But also we have to have a conversation about what Britain is willing to give up in exchange for slowing this migration. The reason why the Conservatives haven't tackled this issue is because big business likes mass migration.
Absolutely.
It has a downward effect on wages, so it keeps wages minimally low. We look at GDP figures and we somehow resemble a dynamic and growing and strong economy when that's not the case. We live in a low wage, low productivity economy, and that's the bigger issue. At the end of the day, under the Labour government of over 13 years of a Labour government, 3.5 million people were allowed into this country, and that was scandalous. You know, Labour is out of control. About what 1 million people in just 2 years of Tory leadership,
and so
that is scandalous. That's horrifying.
No,
it is horrifying.
It's not scandalous. It's not horrifying. It's what is required.
It's completely unsustainable.
It's what is needed.
It's not what's needed.
I'm sorry. And let me explain to you why. If we do not continue to open our door to healthy young people who are going to be able to work.
Where are they going to live?
As an ageing population.
Where are they going to live?
Don't ask me.
Here's what I would say.
We're an ageing population.
If that's true,
we need them.
You say who calls it a problem? David Cameron said we're down to tens of thousands.
Completely unrealistic.
That's why the public believe there's a problem.
Yes.
Because they hear the Prime Minister say that, and now they're seeing nearly 1 million people come in last year.
Which is where
that's not tens of thousands.
Which is where I actually agree with Douglas Murray. And I've said many times before, this focus on the small boats was just it was a smoke screen.
Well, I think there are two different issues.
I
think illegal immigration on the small boats has got to be better controlled. It clearly is, apart from anything else, is an insult to all those who are going through the system legally. But secondly, I just don't think you can have successive prime ministers saying this is a big problem, this net migration. We're going to get it under 100,000, get it down to tens of thousands, and then you see figures like today, where last year alone 750,000.
But Piers, immigrants have always been blamed for the ills in society.
I'm not blaming immigrants.
I'm not saying you are. What I'm saying
control.
is, well, I don't think it is.
It is out of control.
I don't think it is.
It is.
And I think it will increase, and because it needs to increase.
It's out of control by the yardstick set by successive prime ministers who said we have to get it under the tens of thousands. The moment you say that repeatedly, and then you get these numbers, it looks like it's out of control. And my experience, I've got to say, of NHS recently showed me we have big problems with creaking public services. Got to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed.
Murray, however, was ready with a response. He acknowledged the compelling nature of her argument, but reminded her and the audience that the issues at hand were far more complex than a simple narrative of debt and repayment. He argued that many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, were not struggling solely because of debt repayments. Corruption and poor governance played significant roles in perpetuating poverty and underdevelopment. Even if these nations were allowed to default on their debts, Murray contended the underlying issues of corruption and mismanagement would remain unaddressed.
Joining me now is the author of international bestsellers, including his latest, The War on the West, Douglas Murray. Let's start with the UK. The election is less than a month away and Labor are well in front, and you've warned that the modern left is in no way moderate, and this election could unleash a Labor government that is radically left and dangerous. What will a massive Labor landslide mean for the UK?
Well, the first thing about it is that, of course, it'll mean we have more than 100 MPs who nobody has any idea about, nobody has any idea of. We'll just have to expect or guess what their political inclinations will be. The thing we do know is the people who will obviously be in power: Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, David Lammy. These are all people who are sort of people we've got to know a bit, and their political inclinations are pretty clear. They've hidden them from the public a bit in recent months, in particular, as the election has come closer and closer. They've sort of they've become more and more vague about their political ideology, and more and more vague about what they might do once they're in power. But David Lammy, for instance, is somebody who just a little while ago, he's likely to be the next foreign secretary. Just a little while ago, was on a radio show, and he said that not only can a man become a woman, but that if you take the right drugs, a man can grow a cervix. I know it's news to me, and indeed to all biologists and everyone in the field of medicine. But this is a man who believes that a man can grow a cervix if you give him the right pills. So we do actually know where they're coming from on a range of issues. They're just keeping it quiet at the moment in the hope that they will glide silently into office.
Yeah, I fear that they're clever enough to shut their mouths about their true positions on many issues so they can get that landslide. We know immigration is a massive issue in this election. The Tories, well, no one really trusts them because they talk tough about immigration during election campaigns, but they've been allowing more than 1 million into the UK annually. Labor, we know, don't really even believe in borders. And then we've got the BBC giving the likes of this character, the Bishop of Dover, Reverend Rose Hudson Wilkin, a platform. She says illegal immigrants have to cross the Channel because France is not a safe country.
France. It's irrational. You talk about France being a safe...
He went on to discuss the white saviour complex, a term often used to criticise the perceived paternalistic attitude of Western nations towards developing countries. Murray argued that while this critique had some validity, it was overly simplistic and did not account for the genuine efforts made by many Western countries to provide aid and support. He cited the example of the United Kingdom, one of the largest donors of international aid, particularly in regions like Syria. Murray's point was that aid, when properly targeted and managed, could make a significant difference in alleviating suffering and promoting stability. The Muslim student from Georgetown listened intently, her initial confidence giving way to a more thoughtful contemplation. Murray's arguments were not just a rebuttal, they were an invitation to consider the multifaceted nature of global issues. He urged the audience to move beyond binary thinking, to recognise that the world is not divided into oppressors and victims, but rather populated by individuals and societies grappling with a myriad of challenges and opportunities.
Please, I visited a cemetery where there are people, those who have migrated there, who are dying there on that soil, in comparison to what we're talking about, people dying trying to cross the Channel. Okay. So please don't tell me that that is a safe place.
And Douglas, she also said we must stop differentiating between illegal and legal migration because there ought to be no difference.
she is a famous diversity hire in the church. She was recruited by the former speaker John Bercow as his personal chaplain because he was just desperate to make sure he had somebody who was not just black but a woman to signal his own virtue. He turned out to be a difficult character anyway. But yes, she's one of those people whose grift is she's in the church and she tells everyone how racist they are and how sexist they are, and she makes her way up very happily by doing that, and now she's the Bishop of Dover. I don't know. I mean, she sees a different France. I was in Paris yesterday, and I saw a sort of a beautiful, charming, if rather a traffic-clogged city ahead of the Olympics. It's got all sorts of problems, France, Paris in particular, all sorts of security problems, largely brought along by illegal migrants who have the potential to carry out terrorist attacks. But the idea that France is and Paris is this sort of hellhole where migrants are just sort of dying. I don't know what the conditions are that would please somebody like Bishop Rose. If 21st century France isn't good enough, and 21st century Britain definitely won't be good enough, where is good enough? And I suppose maybe a suite at the Ritz for every illegal migrant. Just make sure we dodge all accusations of bigotry. It's preposterous, of course, but I'm hoping that the grift of these sorts of figures is up quite soon. It's high time.
Now, you've written a fantastic piece for the New York Post on the increasingly political and hostile behaviour of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, runs wild, threatening Israel and anyone who criticises it. Tell me about the ICC's response to the 12 US senators that criticised its conduct.
It's amazing. The International Criminal Court, you and I have talked about before, Rita, but the International Criminal Court, having announced that it was going to seek to prosecute Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, the first time it sought to go after a democratically elected leader, got a letter from 12 US senators, and a very good letter it was, saying, if you come for our allies, you come for us, effectively. It was an a one for all for one letter. And the ICC responded. What a kangaroo court it is, without wanting to offend kangaroos. The ICC responded by saying, to criticize the court in this manner may itself be a crime. It breaks Article 50 million of the Rome Statute of blah, blah, blah. And they, so effectively the court said, we're above criticism, because if you criticize us, that might also be a crime. Well, they cited the Rome Statute. America is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. Whether or not the ICC...
Murray's engagement with the student did not end there. He opened the floor to further questions, inviting participants from all walks of life to share their perspectives. This inclusive approach was a testament to his belief in the importance of dialogue and debate. One by one, audience members stepped forward, some supporting Murray's views, others challenging them. Throughout it all, Murray remained composed and respectful, providing thoughtful responses that further illuminated the complexities of the issues at hand. One particularly memorable exchange came when another student questioned the efficacy of aid. She argued that aid often failed to reach those who needed it most, instead lying in the pockets of corrupt officials. Murray conceded that this was a valid concern and emphasised the need for better oversight and accountability in aid distribution. However, he also pointed out that dismissing aid altogether was not a viable solution. The challenge, he suggested, was to find ways to ensure that aid was effective and targeted, helping to build sustainable communities and economies. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. For more content like this, subscribe to the channel.